Richard Sennett is the most fitting speaker one could imagine for the opening lecture conference on disciplinary innovation and the Humanities Centre, a conference that will bring together centre directors from many different worlds, EU, UK and US. Richard was himself the co-founder and director of the New York Institute of Humanities, where academics, publishers, writers, musicians, politicians, journalists gathered for what he himself describes as lousy food and good talk. You should understand Richard is a noted cook. The list of early fellows reads like a who's who of New York intellectual life in the 80s, and this surely is what a Humanities Centre is all about. But Richard Sennett is also a noted disciplinary innovator in his own work, or should I say craft. No one has paid greater attention to the idea and practice of craftsmanship than he. Craftsmanship that may span Linux programmers, Soviet construction workers, or cellists and writers such as himself. Both sociologist and novelist Richard Sennett has vividly evoked the obsessional energy of what he calls quality-driven work, whether the work of Christopher Wren or the work of the writer who recrafts a sentence again and again until it's just right. And yet, like the best craft, his writing looks unlaboured. It does its job of communicating ideas with specificity and directness. It makes the reader think along with him. His title today, Sociology of Literature, captures something of his repeated return to the literary obsessions that run through his career. He writes about ideas as if they were living characters in need of depth and subtlety to be understood. World historical personages from one of his own novels, perhaps, with their own public and private lifelines unfolding with unpredictable yet inevitable logic. So reading one of Sennett's books is more like reading a novel, full of surprising turns and counterturns than anything one usually associates with academic writing, an immersion in the processes of reflection and discovery. Work, culture, craft, flexibility, respect, inequality, urban life, authority, the body, the fall of public man. Private as these energetic obsessions may be, each makes freshly visible a previously unexplored aspect of the social worlds in which we live and work. The term public intellectual is often bandied about. It has a rare good for Richard Sennett. In his work, the empirical drive of sociology, its attentiveness to the particularities of social existence, public and private, is combined with the creativity and elegance of the craftsman. His writing takes the form of a public communication, yet its style is all his own, and his socialist roots run deep. Indeed, his books over the last few decades are prophetic of dilemmas faced by capitalism today, as the G20 leaders meet in London and the crowds gather in Threadneedle Street. It's customary on these occasions to list books and prizes, or else to say that this or that speaker needs no introduction and then go on to do it. Richard, I think, is too well known for either, and he's made himself a friend to many here. I will simply mention The Craftsman, his most recent book, first of a trilogy, and say what a great pleasure it has been to have him in Cambridge, and that, like the tenacious cat, we thought he was a goner, but the cat came back, he will keep coming back.
Well, Mary asked me a few months ago if I'd like to talk personally, and you know, to ask a New Yorker whether he would like to talk about himself is kind of irresistible invitation. But I have been trying to think a little in terms of my own practices as a scholar about the issue of interdisciplinarity. In fact, it's something I've had to think about and I've suffered with most of my writing life. So what I'm going to describe to you today is, in a way, what I've learned about crossing the disciplines between sociology and literature. And if I do speak personally, forgive me, I'm sure there's a moral to be subjects in the past, I have to say, have oriented my research, and they concern work and place. I wanted to know how people labor and how to make a home, and I've had in a way, a preferred method of doing so. I prefer talking to workers and city dwellers directly, face to face. And when I could not, I've tried to use first-person historical accounts to understand these two dimensions of social experience. But this is hardly a discipline in the academic sense. Since you invited me to speak personally, I'll tell you how I came to work in this way. I became an intellectual by accident, only after a hand injury put an end to the career I had intended since I was a little boy, which was as a cellist. When I went into university, I was a decade behind classmates in my reading, and so by necessity I had to obey Feuerbach's rule, quote, read little but read closely. This is very inviting. More, I innocently believe that culture is a unity, and that to understand a culture requires combining ideas from sociology, history, and philosophy. But I assumed that this would somehow self-consciously happen. Like Rossini's Thieving Magpie, I took up ideas as they came to hand, assuming that they had a coherence which I didn't need to worry about. And for this, I paid a price. Unlike the entirely benign school of thought founded by my friend Norbert Elias, who is the author of The Civilizing Process, in my early years, I lacked a method for sifting facts and ideas. And this, I have to say, is true of the philosophical tradition which has always guided me, that of pragmatism. In this tradition, method has a bad name. And as you know, pragmatism does not mean practical in the strict problem-solving sense. It focuses rather on lived experience. We would say in German, it focuses on Erlebnis, experiences it's lived through. And for the sake of being open to new experience, pragmatism dwells less on strategic practice, which in German a kind of experience we think about is Erfahrung. Erfahrung has a method, and Erlebnis has none. Because pragmatism values surprise and curiosity in lived experience, it emphasizes openness and improvisation in understanding. The rigor of a disciplined school of thought is therefore sacrificed. Now, this is where I began, and it never really satisfied me. These are precepts that made sense to me when I began to write. But the lack of a method was something that nagged at me. And to close this personal introduction, what I want to describe to you today is a kind of practice of culture analysis that I put in place of what would be a single academic form of rigor and discipline. It's based quite simply on the belief that social science can, and more I would argue, should be a form of literature. And this conviction carries its own discipline. The discipline is more than writing clearly. Its goal is to achieve that sense of lived experience of Erlebnis on the page. In this talk, I first want to address the issue of why others who make discoveries in sociology, economics, or politics should care at all about literary practice. And this is a matter of scholars connecting to the public realm. From the time of Montaigne, to roughly up to that of Tocqueville. It would have been taken for granted that an analyst of social life should be committed to the craft of writing. Largely this was because early modern society had a verbal blind spot. Encased in rigid, fading social categories of hereditary station, the dynamism and energy of the more modern social order was difficult to describe, even to name. European conquerors of foreign lands, like the Conquistador de las Casas, had to strain to describe the unexpected complexity and richness of the people whose lives the conquerors were destroying. At a later time at home, Montesquieu needed to employ the resources of allegory in the Persian letters to shock his fellow Parisians into an awareness of the localness and limits of European culture. And in the dismal science, Adam Smith needed great verbal gifts to make his contemporaries aware of the power of markets which were coming in to rule their lives. Again, Tocqueville's Democracy in America is laid out quite consciously, I think, on the model of Homer's Odysseus, a voyage into the foreign country of equality. Now, the literary powers of all these writers were meant to arouse in their readers a sense of the social as a problematic category. The writing made a disturbing gift of consciousness, which is to say that the very strengths of their writing helped itself to create a public realm, at least as Hannah Arendt conceived of it, a realm of shared collective intelligence. Today, many social scientists are menaced by exclusion from just this public realm due to their feeble powers of expression. The feebleness is not simply a personal failure. The history of academic institutions seeking to protect their disciplinary boundaries, the specialization and bureaucratization of knowledge itself, are general sources of intellectual isolation and enfeeblement. Feebleness of shared intelligence is but one result of one way of organizing knowledge socially. But the result is that the depth of what researchers know becomes incommunicable due to a lack of expressive tools. The public is left with the husks, the surfaces of knowledge. To me, all writing is political just in the way a writer relates to readers. I've noted with great dismay that when social scientists attempt to address the general public, they tend to survey and to simplify, that is, to talk down, to condescend. The reader is excluded from being a critical partner in the writer's own thinking, whereas Delafosse, Montesquieu, and Tocqueville treated their readers as equals. The politics of talking down to the reader evinces also an error in the understanding of writing itself. People who commit this error may imagine that they can know before they write. They will gather their data and their thoughts, and then, as the English phrase has it, write up the results, displaying to others what they had already thought through. Whereas the act of writing should be a laboratory, a workshop for thinking, not an after-the-fact presentation. When we try to write expressively about society so that others are aroused, are moved by what we write, we encounter a very set of analytic problems. And I want, next into the substance of what I want to say to you, as you may have gathered, I'm extremely long-winded. I want next, and therefore, to talk about the craft of social writing. What I'm going to describe to you are issues from my own experience, certainly not hold myself up as a shining example of writing well, and certainly there are many other solutions to the problem of expressive writing than those I've found. But the problems themselves, I would claim, are generic to socially minded literature. I'm going to lay out to you 4 challenges I've faced in my writer's atelier. These concern issues of authorial voice, narrative, arousal, and generalization. A novelist or playwright also has to deal with this quartet because they are fundamentally properties of literature. But the writer of nonfiction has to address authorial voice, narrative, arousal, and generalization in special ways. So let me first say something about voice. Voice names who is speaking to the reader. In literature, voice is recognized most simply by the use of I or we. The third-person voice in the hands of a great novelist like Flaubert makes the author's presence felt in every word on the page without the author ever speaking personally to the reader. In nonfiction writing, handling the issue of voice is a tricky and often frustrating challenge. Say the writer wants to bring to life on the page the experience of a capable woman working for an incompetent male boss. The sort of boss who takes 3-hour lunches and leaves her to deal in the meantime with all the tough problems in the office. I just choose this out of the air. To make literature this situation, the writer is going to have to do more than just enumerate the circumstances of the sort that I've just named. The writer will have to probe what incompetence means to the long-suffering worker, that is, give her a voice. The writer could do this simply by quoting her complaints, but illustrative quotation is a very static, dull procedure. In fiction, individuals who are portrayed simply as an instance of the category, like the suffering worker, are dead characters. And this is true of nonfiction as well. The writer wants to enter into the rounded, distinctive life of another person, which requires giving that person an interpretive voice, struggling to make sense of his or her circumstance. And here's the difficulty. A thorny social issue lurks in this literary effort. In the 19th century, Wilhelm Dilthey first called for social science to enter the terrain of how people act as their own interpreters, rather than the social science doing the analytic interpretation for them. This is the domain, in Dilthey's word, of Verstehen. As a humanist, he believed people are competent interpreters of their lives. Rejected in particular as an anti-Marxist the idea of a stupid proletariat, Lumpenproletariat. More, Dilthey was convinced that empathy on the part of the researcher will open the gates to understanding. Oppressed would bring forward insight about how the oppressed think, feel, and act. In his view, then, this aspect of personal character, that is, the power to empathize with the subject, is what counts in the craft of Verstehen, of the writing of Verstehen. And the kind of research I do, which is based on interviews, first-person historical accounts, just this matter has proved vexing. Early on in my career, I studied the lives of American white working-class adults and adolescents. It's a book called The Hidden Interest Class. Many of my subjects were hardcore racists and have remained so. These views obviously are repugnant to me. More recently, to give another example, I've studied engineers and computer programmers whose technical passions are largely impenetrable to me. Sheer emotional empathy or mental identification in these cases cannot alone suffice. In the field, I'm a rather combative interviewer, arguing with racist interviewees, challenging engineers to justify whether a technique or procedure matters. Arguing conveys that I take them seriously, which in fact I do. this poses a problem for the writer in writing. Someone who shares my working practice will want to make use of a kind of fictional as-if, reporting what he or she has been told and how it has been interpreted, as if the writer were also a racist or a technician. It's a form of impersonation. And then to step out of that impersonation, that as-if, to judge and pose naive questions. In other words, the technique here is one, and I try to pursue it throughout all my own research, but I say it's a generic one, is what's called doubling. That is not simply empathy, but a kind of identification with somebody else who's interpreting the subject, and then stepping out of that role. And that back and forth is how we create a drama on the page of acknowledging the voice of another person without simply reporting it about. This is clearly what I'm saying about this. That's a craft procedure. It's not a matter of fugue. It's not a matter of sheer empathy. It's a way of dealing with your relation with the subject so that the result on the page is this act of doubling. It means to say that the writing which results should convey a doubling of perspective. On the page there should be more than one active voice. I don't want to get lost in the side issue here, but I want to point out to you, for people who do the kind of work I do, why the notion of overemphasizing the subject with the sufferings of other people is a trap. And we see this oftentimes with very young interviewers, people most of your age. The notion is that people have suffered so much, I am there to bear witness to their sufferings. That is a form of condescension in one way, but worse, it means that the writing itself goes dead. Why are you there? What do you add? So it's a technique in, you can be very sloppy in your emotions as an interviewer, but when you write, you're adding nothing. You are, I would say, condescending if this doubling doesn't produce what is for the reader something active on the page. And readers of reports of suffering often get very bored by them, as you know. 250 pages of descriptions of people starving to death means the reader will only read 3 or 4 of those pages. So it's a distinction between reportage and making voice, a voice in which you intrude rather than simply serve as a witness for others who have suffered. And that's a craft. That's a writing craft. Now I want to say something about narrative. Subject of narrative waves a big warning flag about considering social science as literature. Whereas the novelist is wholly in control of events, the social writer is not. And this truism has a more particular application. Action in a novel accumulates. This is obvious in the classic well-made novel embodied, say, by George Eliot's Middlemarch or Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks. In these narratives, each event, each act prepares for what comes next. The progress of events loads the incidents of action moving forward. Accumulation also operates in more modern novels like James Joyce's Ulysses, or the works of Thomas Bernhard. You need to read these books through to the end to make sense of their fragments. Life histories and collective history do not possess this literary property. Individual life histories are often incoherent, a jigsaw of parts which do not fit together. Collective histories may not accumulate in value. To give you an example of each, many of the workers I've interviewed in the New Economy in my recent books have short-term jobs rather than long-term careers, obliged to change what they do and where they do it by global forces beyond their control. they work very hard, they lack a coherent narrative about the work themselves. Lack of accumulated meaning is something I noted most recently in interviewing a go-go financial manager in New York. The collapse of firms like Long-Term Capital Management a decade ago, or the bursting of the dot-com bubble a few years ago, has made little impress on the manager that I interviewed. His behavior was neither conditioned by nor responsive to prior disasters. This collective history does not accumulate. So you have what is a non-narrative time, even because people are placed in a situation of living in fragments where they themselves are not thinking about their own life experience as forming something in which meaning accumulates. Faced with such incoherence, the social writer might want to chronicle its moments, but not impose a narrative upon the mess. But this would be to do a certain kind of social reality a disservice, a critical social reality. Human beings think in stories in order to understand cause and effect. That is, to give action a value in terms of its consequences. This is a basic impulse in the way in which we try to think critically. Moreover, in everyday narratives, in everyday life, narratives can help people think strategically by projecting different outcomes about an action we might now undertake. Both critical retrospection and strategic projection require imagination not of one certain outcome or cause, but of many possible scenarios. Without narrative as this sort of tool, social understanding is radically diminished for us as the reader. This is narrative as a way we learn to think backward and forward in time, and not simply in cause X produces Y effect. When, as in modern capitalism, people are deprived of a guiding narrative, the writer's task, in my view, is to identify and analyze just these absences, understand why a worker who has been fired or an investor who is ruined cannot connect his or her past, present, and future. This task produces a peculiar narrative of its own, a story marked by gaps and omissions. The writer intrudes into the narrative account that somebody else gives them by naming what's missing, which is really the projection of the author. It means, say, he failed to connect X to Y or X to Y, Z, or to A, B, and C. What the writer is doing in composing the social narrative is essentially identifying and analyzing absence. It's the sort of thing, in a way, you're very familiar with in the narratives of absence, which have marked the writings of Borges or Bernardo Italo Calvino. Today, I would argue, these literary tools help us make sense of a time-fractured political economy. In some, a narrative differs from a history. And it differs because the writer may impose a consequent time, which is what most historians do, or in the kind of narrative that marks sociological discourse, it focuses on omissions, silences as significant part of the story, and identifying why things are not said, why people fall silent, is part of the sociologist's work in composing a narrative. Again, I'm just going to make a very short detail to the side about the craft of interviewing in this regard. When you read poor ethnographic accounts, what you get are a seamless set of sentences that have been transcribed, where all the silences and indeed all the affect is taken out. They read as though they were crafted by, if not Calvino, that the person at least talked very coherently. That's really second quality work. When we do very good ethnography, we have to create a transcript in which all of those elements are present, and particularly the notions of stumbling and silence, pauses. May seem like a small detail to you, but it's precisely in marking and hearing and responding to those things that we understand what it's difficult for people to say and not what they can produce almost mechanically. So that the craft of writing about these silences also means that the interviewer has got to both record them and attend to them. And again, a mistake that beginning interviewers make is to get very uncomfortable when the subject falls silent or stumbles, as though something is going wrong with the interview. You know, the person looks away, they look out of the room, they have nothing to say. They are saying something. You know, if you've asked somebody what it would feel like to be unemployed at month 6 rather than month 4, and somebody begins stumbling, that's your data. But we tend to homogenize all of this because we imagine that what social research is getting people to report on themselves rather than to make this more searching kind of analysis of what they actually express. I want to third talk about the issue of arousal, which is another aspect of craft which I think people miss very much. And I'll tell you a story about myself in that regard. The editor of the New York Review of Books once said to me in rejecting an essay I'd written about Linux as a total amateur open source computer code, the editor said to me, "I'm sure what you say is important, but it just doesn't interest me." Now, the issue here is that it's very easy to believe that the sheer importance of the subject will arouse readers, if not editors. I forgive him already. Open source, after all, the future of computing. But there's no necessary connection between important and arousing. Sometimes writers respond to this dilemma by over-dramatizing an issue to engage other people. They're prone to employ that much abused word crisis to seize attention. Of course, if everything is a crisis, then the word loses any meaning. So we have to grapple in fundamental ways with the nature of stimulation and arousal in writing nonfiction. My starting point has been in my practice that curiosity and surprise are much more lasting stimuli than dread and fear in attaching the reader to the page. Crisis calls attention to a subject, but curiosity takes the reader inside a book. And there are two methods, I think, available to the social writer for stimulating curiosity. The classical psychological studies of curiosity revolve around the experience of cognitive dissonance, a condition in which there are contrary rules and rewards for behavior. Caught in this double bind, humans, like rats in the psychologist's laboratory, can pay close attention to their immediate circumstances, seeking to work out the puzzle. Curiosity is engaged. On the page, the presence of differing dissonant voices, which I described earlier, can have the same effect. When we use the word texture to describe a piece of writing in the non-fictional realm, what we mean, I think, is to invoke just this verbal layering of cognitive dissonance. That is, you believe something and its opposite, which focuses you on the conundrum of something of the subject that you're dealing with. What psychological research in cognitive dissonance reveals is that humans, or rats, caught in contradictions do not go into a state of crisis. They do not go berserk. Instead, they live with the contradiction by focusing on particular behaviors, seeking to manage these within the confines of a larger situation they cannot resolve. In writing, we want to achieve the same kind of focus, setting up contradiction or dissonance in order to focus the reader on significant detail. And this is why, in writing up interview notes, I include bodily gestures or tones of voice as part of my data, since these are frequently ironic or distancing commentaries on the actual words themselves. This distance established between a shrug of the shoulders and a declaration of principle makes the reader pay attention, just as it aroused me in the interview. So the logic of this for the writer is to find not just focus on facts or details, but focus on facts or details which often physically contravene verbal declaration. It's one of the reasons that there's been, I think, such a productive turn to visual ethnography in sociology, and both photography and video, because it gives us a tool to say what people's body language is like when they tell you, I absolutely would like to see all blacks, removed from universities. If somebody smiles, you believe them. If they look down on the ground, you know that you've got a different kind of, in shame, you know you've got a different kind of social information. That's a sidebar. So that is a question, in other words, of stimulating curiosity, of actually trying to find and locate significant detail and focus within cognitive dissonance. Another practice which stimulates curiosity revolves around tacit knowledge, the assumptions we take for granted, the behaviors we practice unconsciously. A bad social writer will surface these tacit assumptions through an active accusation. When you say that, you really mean, or when they say that, they really mean. The writer who wants to make people curious about them will instead gradually surface these taken for granted to the reader's conscious by a process of mutation, changing what everybody knows step by step so that it appears increasingly strange and provoking. Thus, when writing The Fall of Public Man, I explored the handshake, a seemingly mundane form of public reading, connecting it in the 18th century to other bodily gestures of addressing strangers, then to habits of speaking in taverns and coffee houses. My reader, I hope, became more and more aware and more curious about the meaning of shaking hands as it became connected to hugging, kissing, and to verbal salutes. It began to appear that the act of shaking hands was a violation, whereas the kiss was not, for instance. Thus, the procedure of arousing the reader's interest, and this procedure of arousing the reader's interest also gave something to me. I began to be able to see the public realm as a realm of sensate physical experience in which one bodily gesture was used to countervail or negate another. What I'm trying to say to you is that in place of dramatization, the socially minded writer wants to use techniques like cognitive dissonance or the permutation of detail to arouse interest in his or her subject. Again, there's a politics implicit in this kind of writing. The language of crisis is cousin to the manifesto, to the pronouncement. The languages of cognitive dissonance and permutation acquire. They're closer to everyday life. They invite the reader to engage rather than to agree. Of course, I do not mean to imply that we should always prefer the quiet politics of writing. Dramatizing is a necessary tool in any writer's craft. I only mean that this tool should be handled with great care, as Michel Foucault does, for instance, at the opening of Discipline and Punish, in describing the execution of Damien, the would-be killer of Louis XV. The circumstances of Damien's torture are grisly and dramatic, but Foucault's art as a writer lies in connecting by small permutating suggestions elements in the scene of Damien being ripped, drawn on the court, ripped apart, to identify events and ideas which have nothing to do with an execution. I hope I've persuaded you by now that writing is something more than simply the means to an end. It is a craft which transforms both the research practice of sociology and, of course, also always its expression. But what then is the consequence of trying to pursue this kind of writer's craft in terms of voicing narrative and stimulating curiosity? This leads me to the fourth element of social issue literature, which addresses the problem of generalization. The practices of social literature I've described to you so far dwell on individuals and particulars. It would be perfectly correct to assert that no matter how engaging, such experiences can make no claim to represent general social conditions. The critic will turn my own words against me. No one human being ever represents a social category. Great fiction wants to commit, however, just this mistake. The novels of Balzac and Proust invite the reader to make a metaphor of political corruption out of Vautrin's crimes, or to read into Baron de Charlus's posturing the decline of an entire aristocratic class. We can't help ourselves from accepting the invitation to generalize. The American pragmatist C.S. Peirce offers one explanation why. Categories of any sort are mental constructs. Social categories are particularly fragile mental constructs. Since a category composed of 1 million people is based, it cannot be based in any one person's consciousness, must be based on insufficient information. To construct a category, a social category, we have therefore and necessarily to make a leap of what Peirce calls radical induction, from lived experience to experiences we could not have. The theoretical issue here is that symbols make this leap of radical induction for us. I know you're going to disagree with this. I see it already as a philosophical threat here. Symbols make this leap of radical induction, be they symbols, these symbols, social statistics, or the characters and events in literature. But symbols, in the pragmatist tradition, are not generalizations. Still, Peirce's precept doesn't explain what the writer might do to make personal experience resonate symbolically. That's our task. In creative literature, radical induction may seem no less than an unfathomable secret of great art. In social writing, I believe, concrete steps can be taken to induce radical induction, to create symbols out of experience rather than generalizations. And I'm going to describe in this regard just steps I've tried to take as a writer. The procedure I've used derives from the experience I've had as a musician rehearsing chamber music with other players. In rehearsing chamber music, the players, of course, have to achieve a coherent collective sound. It equally must preserve the distinctiveness of each instrument. If that balance can be struck, then each instrumental part seems to loom larger, mean more, than when the player rehearses alone, although he or she is playing the very same notes. And this is how a musical process of symbol making occurs at group rehearsals. The notes of each part are transformed in value while remaining the same in material fact. Now, I've drawn on my sociological work on just this experience of musical rehearsal, even when I interview people individually. Typically, I will try to interview in depth about 30 to 50 people who share something in common, like the middle-ranking computer programmers I interviewed for the book, The Corrosion of Character. I'll then ask them to talk about this shared condition. In writing up their varied interpretations, I try to stage something like a group rehearsal on the page, one in which individual beliefs or experiences mean more when played together with or against others. Hopefully, the reader later joins the rehearsal if the writing works. If it does not, I want to emphasize, beget generalizations about programmers, for instance. Instead, it activates the process of symbolization in which the experience of each becomes a kind of dialogue with the others. It becomes an individual report, but meaningful through association. I don't know if this is clear to you. It's a way of dealing with data so that if we've got, I've just done a study with my students of 200 unemployed people on Wall Street. It's a huge archive of stuff. The idea is not to find a common thread, and certainly not to press the button which says, thematic analysis, find everybody saying the same thing. You can get computer programs like that, but they're useless. What you want to do is look at the ways in which something like long-term unemployed is used differently by people, and then use it as a kind of rehearsal on the page for what that means. And that's the process in this studies of unemployment we're now engaged in. In other words, you don't want to generalize by finding something that all 200 share. That's not possible with the kind of material we deal with. And in fact, I'd say it's a kind of lie to take 200 people and say they represent 2 million. You want to do something different. You want to make the reader think about unemployment by seeing perhaps 200 different ways that people can discuss it. What's possible in that interpretive frame? And that's how this issue is, for me, in my practice, dealt with. The distinction between generalization and symbol is a keystone of pragmatic philosophy. While the generalization is a fixed statement, the symbol is a dynamic process which helps us relate experiences to one another. That's what sociology is about. Just that. This is why I would say to you that the work of symbol making, as a process, is the sort of ultimate sociological destination for sociology as literature. This symbol rather than the generalization. I've tried to show through these techniques of voicing, narrating, stimulating curiosity, and symbol making how the writing of social literature is a craft. As in any other craft, inspiration is no guide, nor in this particular craft will humanistic empathy suffice. The social writers I particularly admire, Walter Benjamin, Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, or Michel de Certeau, write quite differently from each other, yet all share an essential ethos of craftsmanship. All established a set of practices for their prose, and these practices evolved in the course of their careers. They could thus make discoveries rather than simply demonstrate skill. And all craftsmanship should have that aspiration, because good technique is not a fixed, closed system. So if I sound as though I've given you rules for how to do something, I haven't a habit. These have served me, but you might find other ones. But the goal of them is to make of sociology something which, and social research, something which has some of the power and the cognitive depth, as well as emotional depth, of great literature. I'd like to just close, I'm sorry to have spoken so long, but I'd like to just close this talk by just an informal remark. And again, this takes me back to the personal. What I've described to you is something that's very hard to situate in any academic institution. It's almost impossible to teach this that I've described to you. It is a practice in which a teacher can be a critic, but it's really an engagement in the social world with a certain kind of goal in mind. We had 3 weeks ago at Crash an event, another conference, international conference of a group that's been working for 7 years doing cultural analysis and writing called Nylon, which used to represent New York and London. We're not going to have to call it NICAM. And it's taken, these are mostly PhD students, research students, and it takes them about 3 or 4 years in this group. It's only a workshop for writing to begin to get the idea of how to write so that they not simply demonstrate that they're proficient. They don't make a display of skill, but they actually make something that somebody else is engaged by. They cross over from that barrier, which most formal education does, of making people legitimate the fact of their own competency. And this act of legitimation through testing, formal ways, is deadly. That kind of display of just how smart you are is deadly for the practice of this kind of writing. So it sits very badly within university context. The Nylon or NICAM, as we have to now call it, is something that was invented by Craig Calhoun and myself, and was sort of invisible bureaucratic. Many other activities like this. The point I'm trying to make to you about this is that this is, I think, an intellectual pursuit, and it's an intellectual discipline, but it's very hard to make it an academic